Welcome to the Marsha and Portia Project, episode 5.
In today's episode, we are going to give you a brief overview of the United States Constitution, the history behind it, and a couple of fun facts that you might not be aware of. I think we could all brush up a little bit on some of our facts. Most of us are really familiar with dates like 1776 and July 4th and things like that, but when it comes to digging a little deeper, we don't really know a lot about what's behind it. Mm-hmm. So this is going to be a part 1 of 2 to just talk about what the Constitution has done for us. So like I said, most of us are familiar with July 4th, 1776, when all the colonies declared their independence from Great Britain and King George III.
Which was a huge deal. Like, that was an act of tyranny in and of itself. Like,
absolutely.
They were rebelling against, like, the greatest
empire, really.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's a big deal.
Yeah. But what many of us might not realize or maybe not remember from school is that the Constitution we're governed by today was actually not written or formally introduced until about 10 years later in 1787, with some of pieces of the government not being actually confirmed until 1789. So the states made the Articles of Confederation, which was basically like part of the Declaration of Independence. That's kind of what everything was started on.
It was our initial kind of governing document.
Exactly. That's a much better way to say it. It allowed there to be some trading, some agreements, but it really...
The states kind of governed themselves under the Articles of Confederation, and there wasn't really any room for a national governance.
Yeah, they basically came together and said, hey, we want our freedom, but we are so afraid and so sick of the overstretch of government through the monarchy that we've just been ruled by for, centuries, that we do not want any centralized government. So that's kind of what the Articles of Confederation were. But, about 10 years later, it was pretty clear, and they started to realize that they needed some central hub of government. There wasn't an easy way to agree on trade or how to pass goods down the river from states to states with all these adjoining, boundaries. So they came back together and they wrote what we now know to be the Constitution of the United States. It's really a simple document. The way they wrote it was only 4 pages long.
It is. And it is the shortest constitution that is in effect.
True.
But it's
modern day, it would be about 8 pages typed.
Yeah, but it's the most brilliant. It is the most brilliant political document that's ever been written.
Absolutely.
And it's our country's foundational legal document. And I just think it's interesting that it's so short. Like, if you think about Congress's most recent stimulus bill.
It was 5,000 pages,
5,000 pages. And our nation's foundational, governing document was 5 to 7 pages. I mean, it's just the brilliance that the founders had in crafting a document that was so simple, yet so radical and so comprehensive is really, I think, really neat. And I think it's something that we kind of forget about. Because a lot of people haven't read the Constitution. I think some people might not understand that it's pretty short and you can read it pretty quickly.
Absolutely.
I mean, you can actually understand it. A lot of people might think, there's all this flowery language that I don't understand. Well, no, it's a pretty easy to read document.
Lots of other countries have tried to emulate our Constitution, and they end up writing hundreds of pages worth of a Constitution. So we both find it very interesting that ours has been kept so succinct and short, and it is the same foundation that governs us 200 years later, quite literally. So let's talk a little bit more about it. The original Constitution had a preamble. Most of us are pretty familiar with that part.
We the people, that's the preamble of the Constitution.
7 articles, and then a closing statement. So pretty simple, pretty broken up into just 7 organized articles. And then Article 5 being what allowed for amendments. So I think this year there's been a lot of chatter about what our nation was founded on. And we're going to get into that in part 2, the values behind the Constitution. But a lot of people talking and chatter about why the Constitution was written the way it was. But a key to remember from what we just talked about was they wanted to get away from oppression, from tyranny, and total control. That's why people migrated towards the United States, and that's what ultimately led to writing the United States Constitution. However, there was disagreement right off the bat about some things like religion, Native Americans, owning slaves. And so Article 5 in the original Constitution allowed for amendments to be made with the knowledge that they wanted to evolve into something better than they had experienced before. So that's really what Article 5 was about.
And I think what's really one of the key themes of the United States Constitution is it is consent of the governed. So it is a government that was created for the people and by the people. And I think a lot of times in modern day, we forget that our government works for us and under our consent, by our consent.
Right. And that's obvious with the way the amendments in Article 5 were allowed to happen. So we've had 27 amendments. A proposal for an amendment cannot even get pushed past Congress if there's not a 2/3 majority vote. And then in order for an amendment to be ratified, 38 out of 50 states must ratify that amendment. So it really does reflect the fact that this is supposed to be a popular government in terms of being governed by the populace. So those are just a couple fun facts about what the Constitution is. Obviously, when we hear the Bill of Rights, that's referring to the collective of the first 10 amendments that outline the specific rights endowed to all of us as citizens.
Which, little known fact, Mercy Otis Warren, one of our namesakes, she was an early champion of the Bill of Rights, and she actually wrote a piece, not under her own name, but she wrote a piece that challenged the Constitution as it was written without the Bill of Rights, and in it kind of laid the foundation for rights granted in the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. So we're really proud to have Mercy Otis Warren as one of our namesakes.
For sure. I love that.
I do too.
It's a great fact. Okay, so what are the key takeaways that apply to us now? I think there's about 5 points that we kind of summarize and that I think are kind of popular opinion. What's the 5 points or 5 big takeaways for what the Constitution provides to us as citizens? So let's just talk about that a little bit. First thing is, to establish a popular government. We talked in previous episodes about what a democracy and a republic is and some representatives, but the basic thing that you need to understand is that a popular government is designed for people, individual humans, to have sovereign rights, to be the source of government. Humans are endowed with an divine sovereign right to enable their government to help facilitate and run trade and things like that. And with the guaranteed right to elect representatives in a democratic republic to do that.
Right. So our foundational document grants us, well, it enumerates certain rights that we have and that we are born with as humans, but how our government was created is that we have representation, but there are rights that can never be taken away. And we consent to government governing us by virtue of the Constitution and power over us by the states. But I just think it's really interesting that it was to kind of solidify the rights that we have already. Not the government gives us, but the rights that we are granted just by virtue of being born humans in America.
Yeah. And number 2 point would be the separation of powers. So this outlines the 3 branches of government, the Supreme Court, the Congress, the office of the president. Obviously, most of us learn about those things in school. It's really...
I think a lot of us also forget about those things in school.
Well, they're boring, right?
Yeah. And I think people forget, I saw a recent poll of America, you see the people going around the streets and polling average Americans, and quite a few of them couldn't articulate the 3 branches of the United States government.
And it's interesting because the founding fathers wrote the Constitution, if you read it, for Congress to be kind of the heavier hand, to be the main branch.
The legislative branch.
Yes, exactly. Right. And to have 2 houses so that the average person would have a voice in the federal government decisions, and that both large and small states would have equal representation. It was meant to be the strongest branch. So
it's interesting that so much emphasis is put on the executive branch and who sits in the seat of the president. And it seems like, every 4 years we put so much attention on who's running for president and who's going to run our country. But really how the founders envisioned power being distributed through our government is that we would have a very strong legislative branch.
And they did that in opposition to the monarchy they had experienced. So the idea that we would have like these two representative houses with the executive branch playing a role, but not playing the role that we've come to know today. And now with sometimes the overstep of executive powers with three-letter agencies that are not in the Constitution, FBI, CIA, IRS, things like that. So it really has changed, probably in a way they couldn't have totally predicted, which is really interesting. But separation of powers was a big focus of our Constitution, and that has to also, point 3 would be the checks and balances at all levels.
Right.
So we see this kind of model of government in our state legislatures, our state governments, and down to the local level. So the idea that there would be very clear checks and balances and representation that would be equal were several main focuses of our Constitution. 4 being limited government, and that kind of goes back to almost point number 1. The people would decide how much power to give the government through their right to vote, which is a very hot topic right now because we have to be able to trust that our vote and our voice matters and that there is integrity in that process, because our whole government is based on the premise
we elect representatives,
that we have a voice through our vote, our legal vote.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, to think about how the founders conceptualized our form of government and created a document that really did provide for limited government, and now to look at all the ways that government impacts our daily life. Like, government has a hand in what feels like every single thing we do. And I think it's just interesting to think about. I mean, obviously, our lives have changed with the invention of like technology and all sorts of things, but how much power government has over our lives, I think, is something that the founders would not even be able to recognize.
Right, like down to getting a permit to put a new window in your house, or you've got to have this kind of toilet in your home, or you can't grow a marijuana plant in your backyard. So there are things that, even though they
can't operate your business.
Yeah, they made a process for amendments. There were things they might not have foreseen in terms of some of the corruption that has happened to cause such regulation into our everyday lives, which is, again, something we're going to get into in part 2. And that kind of goes along with kind of the 5th point of the Constitution, which is federalism. And that refers to the division of power inside the government. It gives local governments the authority to self-govern. That way, people in different regions and states who may have different needs or different climates or lifestyles, they are able to collectively come together on a smaller level and say, hey, this is what our state needs, if we're primarily farm country, or maybe, you've got different agriculture in different states. So that was the idea of decentralizing the federal government, because there's really not a one size fits all for Americans. We have such a vast country with such vast topography and weather that each region and state needs freedom to make our own decisions.
Right, and they need a say, and they need, that's why, for example, like the Electoral College was put into place so that the principle of federalism could be protected, and so that individual Americans could ensure that they did have representation that was true to their wants and desires and what they believe to be important, their values. And I think now more than ever, the principle of federalism is so important. I mean, you're looking at how states are even just treating the coronavirus so differently. And it's just interesting to think about the fact that the Constitution really was founded on the principle that the states should have sovereign power over their affairs.
So big takeaways are our Constitution was born out of a desire to get away from total control. It was designed to establish individual liberties, which had really been unprecedented before that in world governments and different empires, and there's a whole history lesson to be had there. But to get away from that, but then also to provide a centralized hub that would support trade and travel and freedom for people to create.
And
so that was the basis of why the Constitution was written the way it was written, with the understanding that changes would need to be made, which is why we have 27 amendments and the ability to create more if we need to.
And I think in this time when there is a lot of hostility politically, I just think it's important to remember that our country was founded under the principle of individual liberties and a limited government and a consent by the people to be governed. And I think, we just have to remember those things, and we have to remember that truly our Constitution is the greatest political document ever written, and we are blessed to live in a country with the enumerated rights that we have and with the system of government that we have. And I think it's important for Americans to understand our foundational document a little bit better.
And because we feel this is so important, we are going to do a part 2 about the values behind our enumerated rights. And I've seen a lot on social media the past couple of years, which I think is fantastic, about finding your why, coming up with your core values, implementing your belief system. And because there is a lot of topic about the values and the intent behind the Constitution, we wanted to dedicate a whole episode to talk about what the values really were, so that we can just go back to the basics.
Yeah.
So
that's next episode.
So stay plugged in. We'll be posting part 2 in the next day or so. And drop us any comments if you have more questions about the history of the Constitution. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Sorry, I didn't know what to say at the end.
I didn't either.